agreed to come to Chico was that 30 years ago, as a young writer, I came out here to do one of the very first stories about microbreweries in America. And at the time, Sierra Nevada was in an industrial park. There was a little shed, quarter the size of this room, and there were just a couple of tanks, and Ken Grossman, not quite yet a billionaire, was opening the tap on the Celebration Ale for us to kind of just put our mouths underneath and try on things. So it was a great pleasure to get a tour today from the excellent farmer there and a first nectarine of the season out of those trees, and then to sit in the pub and drink several different delicious varieties. I had actually a quite interesting drink with your local climate skeptic, Anthony Watts, who I'm always interested in meeting. And all in all, it was really fun. This is a beautiful community. And just to be here amongst its trees and greenery, and to drive through the center of town and see people playing music there in the town square, and just to be, well, it felt for me very much at home, because I live in Vermont, and there's that same kind of sense always, a strong community sense, lacking in many places in this country, but palpable here. Y'all are lucky to be here, and I'm lucky to be here. Now, I'm also always conscious when I come to speak in a beautiful place on a beautiful day, amidst all sorts of great people doing amazing things. I'm also always very conscious that my basic role in life is just to bum people out, and for that I apologize, and I will try to kind of get through it and get on to more hopeful stuff. But there's no avoiding the situation we're in. There's no use talking about the scale and pace of the solutions to this problem until we have some sense of the scale and the pace of the problem itself. And that makes for difficult discussion, frank discussion, because you all are well situated now, 4 years into your drought, to have some beginning visceral sense of what this world is turning into. It was, for me, deeply unsettling to fly in yesterday over the Sierras in the first week of June and see not a lick of snow. Anyway, no, none. That's country I love, that I've backpacked through, skied in. To see it beginning to change in those profound ways is remarkable, and it reminds us of the kind of epic moment in which we live. In terms of the kind of time scale of civilizations, this crisis that we're now having to address has come on us rather suddenly. I wrote the first book for a general audience about climate change, and it came out 26 years ago. That's really how long. We've had a quarter century as a society to even begin to grapple with the idea that we're, for the first time, changing absolutely everything around us. And that quarter century has gone faster than we thought it would. That is to say, in 1989, when I was writing The End of Nature, no scientist thought that we would, in this short period of time, see 70% of the summer sea ice in the Arctic gone. Nobody thought that the oceans would already be 30% more acidic. These were things that we thought were still 50, 100, 150 years out into the future. But the planet turns out, as far as we can tell, to be very finely balanced. We've only raised the temperature of the Earth 1 degree. But that's been enough to change things in a fundamental way. Changes the map of the world. If you look at Earth from outer space during the northern hemisphere summer, The Arctic looks nothing like what it looked like to the astronauts up in the Apollo missions. There's the Northwest Passage, the Northeast Passage, open. I mean, these are things that people thought no human would ever sail through. This year, they're going to be a yacht race through the Northwest Passage. The chemistry of the world is changing. We are an ocean planet. So it is not good news that the oceans are fundamentally different, that their pH has shifted, that if you stick a piece of pH paper in the ocean now, it'd come out a different color than it would have 30 years ago. Okay? That's not good news for the small creatures at the bottom of the marine food chain, really at the bottom of our planet's web of life, who can't do what they need to do if the calcium chemistry of the ocean is twisted in that way. The color of the world is changing, what the scientists call its albedo, its reflectivity. When you take all that snow off the Sierras and the Cascades and off the top of the country, I mean, it was warmer last week in Alaska than it was in Arizona. There were 90-degree temperatures in Fairbanks, okay? There's not any snow up there at the moment, and that means that when the sun beats down, it doesn't bounce off nice white snow and ice anymore. It is absorbed by the planet. Those kind of big changes, even at 1 degree, are already having remarkable effects. You clearly see it here with the drought in California. But California is a rich place. If there is any place on Earth that can deal with the drought, then probably, at least for a little while, it's a place like this. Not easily, but there are things that can change, that can be cut back, can be shifted. You don't maybe need to grow rice across the valley or to have, almonds in every direction or whatever else. Do make sure there's water supply to the brewery would be my advice. There are other places where this hits much harder. 4 or 5 years ago, the Fertile Crescent there in the Middle East suffered through the worst drought that we have records of, dating back as far as records go, as far back into history as we can look. And scientists, social scientists, are now writing paper after paper explaining that this is one of the things that triggered off that civil war in Syria. As 1 million or so people had to leave the farm and crowd into the cities, and the tensions that erupted helped undercut what was already a violent situation, and now it spreads across the Middle East. This is a taste of what comes to a world, a crowded world, where people are going to be on the move and pushing in on each other. Once all that water's evaporated up into the atmosphere, once that happens, it's going to come down someplace too. Water vapor only spends about 7 days, a water molecule on average, in the atmosphere before it comes down. And we see what happens now when it comes down in deluge. Last week in Texas and Oklahoma, the drought ended. It ended with extreme suddenness. In fact, we have rainfall records dating back 120 years in Texas and Oklahoma. That means we've measured how much rain fell there every month for 120 years. 12 times 120 is, I can't quickly do the math, but it's a lot of, it's 1,400 or 1,500 monthly rainfall records, okay? Texas last month had 17% more rain than any month on record. Oklahoma had 24% more rain than any month on record. Any of you who know anything about statistics and about large data sets know that that's essentially statistically impossible to see outliers like that out of this. But that's because the world that we live in now is not the world in which those records, those old records, were set. This is a new world. Warm air holds more water vapor than coal. It's just a hotter world. 2014 was the warmest year on record on this planet. So far, 2015 is crushing 2014 for its record. California the last 2 years has been much, much higher. California broke its old record last year by a full degree, which is, again, a sort of statistically impossible thing to do, but you have some sense of what it starts to feel like when that happens. And the tough news is that we're just at the beginning of this. We've raised the temperature 1 degree Celsius so far, but the same scientists who told us that that was going to happen now tell us that if we're on our current track without dramatic alteration, far more than any government's planning at the moment, the temperature is going to go up 4 or 5 degrees Celsius in the course of this century. Think about that for a minute. If 1 degree has taken things to the point where we're right at the edge of being able to, say, grow food in the Central Valley of California, try to imagine what 4 or 5 degrees does. In fact, the scientists have done more than try to imagine. The agronomists at Stanford and the University of Washington have published a series of papers in recent times saying that from this point on, we should expect each degree increase in global average temperature to cut grain yield something like 10%. You guys can do the math. The temperature goes up 2 or 3 degrees and the number of calories on Earth goes down 20 or 30%. Think about what that means for all the things that we care about, for development, for poverty, for public health, for war and peace, for women's rights, for all the things at risk on a quickly destabilizing and degrading planet. We cannot let it happen. The biggest thing that has happened in the lifetimes of every person in this room, the most important thing, is that the planet left behind the Holocene. Sometime in the last 20 years, we crossed some invisible line that separates us from the Holocene, from the 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that coincided not coincidentally with the rise of human civilization. Every human being for whom we have records lived during the Holocene until us. And now we're going into some new world, and the only question is how far in we're going. That's depressing. And so I will give you a break for a minute and tell you the good news, at least potentially good news, which is that we needn't go all the way into that new world. We can't stop climate change, but we can stop it short of, we hope, utter disaster, and we have the tools to do it. Again, these are new developments. 25 years ago, when environmentalists talked about or wrote about, say, renewable energy, they did it with their fingers crossed, okay? Solar power wasn't yet ready for prime time. It was sort of something that aging hippies down in the basement with the lead acid batteries, you know, and thank God they did, because they set the groundwork for what's become a real revolution. If you want a piece of very good news, I'm a connoisseur of sad statistics, but also good ones. The price of a solar panel has fallen 98% in the last 30 years. It's fallen 75% in the last 6 years. That changes the realm of what's possible on this planet. Across most of the Earth now, it's as cheap to generate electricity from the sun as it is from coal or gas or oil, or the wind too. I mean, the few places that have tried to do this demonstrate how possible it is. Last year, the Danes generated 40% of their power from wind. This is not because the Danes have some monopoly on wind. They're not hogging it all and preventing the rest of us from having it. Okay? Already this summer, there have been days when Germany generated 80% of its power from solar panels within its borders. Germany! Okay? Germany is, I mean, some of you have been to Germany. It's, you know, it's foggy, it's Wagnerian, it's, you know, it's not like Chico, okay, where you could generate all your power with tons left to spare from the sun, and you should be. Costa Rica, poor country, in the first 4 months of this year generated absolutely every bit of electricity it used from renewable sources. We could easily scale this up. Not for free, and not without effort, but doably. 2 days ago, a group of scientists and economists calling themselves the Apollo Coalition said that with an effort comparable to the one that put a man on the moon in the course of 10 years over the 1960s, with that same scale of scientific effort, by 2025, the world could be powering itself renewable energy. So that's the good news. Okay? The interesting question, sad but interesting, is why, given all that, we're not doing it. Not doing it on any scale that matters, not really seizing this moment, not doing so far in this country more than a token effort. In fact, if you looked at Washington, you could say with too much accuracy that we've had a 25-year bipartisan effort to do nothing about this problem. And it's been more or less successful. Okay? That's a hard thing for us to face, to figure out why the optimistically named Homo sapiens, warned of the most dangerous thing that's ever come at them, have so far done next to nothing to dodge that incoming asteroid. And the answers are complex. There's many things one could say. You could talk about human psychology and how we're better at reacting to immediate threats than longer-term ones. You could talk about our theology and dominion over nature. You could go on and on about all sorts of things, and all of which is true to one degree or another. But I got to say, after a couple of decades of fighting this fight, the most important reason that we haven't done anything, and the one that we can do something about, because we're not going to change in a relevant time period everything to do with human psychology, and we're not going to invent a new religion that we all subscribe to, and we're not. The one thing we can do something about, and the thing that's at the root of our problem, is the fact that the fossil fuel industry, the richest industry on Earth, has done everything it can do to keep us from changing. It's taken that wealth and used it to block change. Exxon has made more money each of the last 4 years than any company in the history of money. Okay? Exxon at its annual meeting last week in Texas, while the rain was falling, while they were digging bodies out of creek beds, the CEO of Exxon, paid $100,000 a day, stood up and, as the newspaper accounts put it, mocked renewable energy, and said that if indeed things like sea level rise or inclement weather became a problem, then we would figure out technological means to deal with these adversities going forward. Shell Oil. Shell Oil, in the last few years, sold off all its solar and wind divisions. At the moment, if we can't stop them up in Seattle, where thousands of people in kayaks have been trying to blockade their drilling rig, they will go into the Arctic this summer to open up a big new oil field. Think about that for a minute. We poured carbon into the atmosphere, it raised the temperature, it melted the Arctic. That is, it broke one of the biggest physical features on the planet. Looking at that, did people like Shell, or for that matter, any of our leaders, say, this would be a good signal that we should take some different path? No. They looked at it and said, now that it's melted, it'll be easier to drill for oil up there. Okay? That, when they get ready to write the histories of this time on Earth, that'll be the illustration of our folly and our cynicism. And it just goes on and on. The Koch brothers, taken together, the richest man on Earth, right, made all their money from oil and gas. They're the biggest leaseholders up in the tar sands of Canada. They announced a couple of weeks ago that they were planning to spend $900 million on the next federal election. Okay? That's more money than the Republicans will spend or the Democrats will spend. Koch brothers, party of two. Okay? And they will spend it to make sure that nothing ever changes. Left to their own devices, this force of the fossil fuel industry is strong enough to delay action long enough to break the planet. There's, I think, little doubt of that. The gains in engineering and renewable energy are coming fast, but they're not coming fast enough unless we figure out how to weaken those guys for us to make the shifts that we need to make. And so that's really what I want to talk about. Whether we can beat these guys, and if so, how. I think we can. I don't know that we can, but I think that we can. And I just want to tell a few stories along that line tonight. Look, I am not an activist by temperament or inclination. Susan said I'm a writer, okay? It's good fun to be here with you all, but left to my own devices, I'd rather be in my room typing, okay? But at some point in the last 10 or 15 years, it really became clear to me that writing another book was not going to move the needle on this, because we'd already won the argument, okay? We'd already won the argument. We were just losing the fight because the fight wasn't about science and data. The fight, as fights usually are, was about power. Power of the fossil fuel industry comes from money. They have far more than we will ever have. And so we need to find a different currency to work in. And the only currency that suggests itself to me is the currency of movements. The passion, the spirit, the creativity that occasionally human beings manage to summon up in numbers large enough to make a difference. So, that's what we've been trying to do for the last little while. Susan, do you suppose there's a glass of water around someplace? I'd be so grateful. Let me show you. Well, you know, we started this thing, 350.org. Susan said 7 or 8 years ago, and it was myself and 7 college students. And it was a ludicrous proposition, really. You know, we had no money, we had no lists, we had no anything. And our theory was that we should go out and organize the whole world to fight against climate change. It's a good thing we didn't know any better, because that's what we decided we'd do. In a sense, that's why we have that strange name. 350 is the most important number in the world. It's how much carbon the scientists say the atmosphere can safely contain, a number obviously that we're already well north of, about 400 parts per million and going up 2 or 3 parts per million per year, which is why the Arctic's melting, it's why California is parched, it's why Texas is underwater, on and on and on. So it's an important number, but you wouldn't normally try to sort of build a movement around a scientific data point, you know? It's not as good as I have a dream or, you know, whatever. But on the other hand, if you're trying to organize globally, the fact that everyone around the world insists on speaking their own language becomes something of a barrier, okay? So Arabic numerals become your friend. 350 means the same thing. Thank you so much. 350 means the same thing in Chico and in China, you know? And so we set to work. There were 7 college students. There were 7 continents. Each one took one. The guy who got the Antarctic also had to take the internet. Okay, so we set off, and our job was to find other people like ourselves. And there's not everywhere someone called an environmentalist, you know, but everywhere there's someone who cares about hunger, about development, about women's rights, about all the things that are so threatened. Okay, public health. Those were the people that we sort of found, or found us. And we asked everybody back in 2009, and I tell this story because I know that there were people in Chico who helped right from the start. We asked everybody to come together for a day, to kind of try and take this number and this idea and stick it into the bloodstream of the planet. And we had no idea really if it would work or not. We picked a Saturday almost at random in the fall of '09, I think. And we got the sense 2 days early that it might kind of work. We were sitting around our office on Thursday, you know, one table like that, the 8 of us in it, just doing our work on our laptops, and the phone rang, and it was our volunteer leader in Ethiopia. Everybody's volunteer. Like many of our leaders, she was a she, and like a fair number of them, she was 17. And she was in tears. She said, the government's taken away our permit for our rally on Saturday. So we're doing it today before they can stop us, okay? Which was brave, because it's not a very nice government, but that wasn't why she was crying. She just kept saying, we wanted to do this the same time as everybody else. We wanted to be part of the big thing. We don't want to jump the gun. We're really sorry. And we have 15,000 kids right now out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. You know? So we were like, well, don't worry about the date. It's okay. You know? And let me see if I can move this just a bit here. I'm not sure I can. For the next 72 hours, these pictures just kept flooding in from every corner of the world. The second one actually came from U.S. troops in Afghanistan. It said, we made a 350 with sandbags. We said, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking. Okay? But most of them, and they just flooded in from... I'd always heard my whole life, environmentalism is something that rich white people do. If you worried where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't think, what did I know? You know, but it took about an hour of watching these pictures roll in, sometimes 20 a minute, you know, from around the world, to know that that was just complete nonsense, that most of the people who were leading this fight were poor, black, brown, Asian, and young, because that's what most of the world, it turns out, consists of, okay? And what do you know, exactly as worried about the future as anybody else, maybe more so, because the future bears down pretty hard on you if you're in those kind of people with enormous wit and creativity in every corner of the world. Big involvement of religious communities, which was great to see. There's the head of Muslim South Africa, the head of kind of indigenous traditions behind them, the Anglican Archbishop at the head of a big Marge. That's our biggest evangelical college where Billy Graham went to school. I'd been to the Middle East to do some organizing. Dead Sea shrinking very rapidly as the temperature rises. It's a little hard to see on this screen, but everybody wanted to do something together, but there's too many armies in the way, you know. So the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do big 5 on our shore. The Israelis did the 0. It was a good day, you know. 300 big demonstrations in China, where China's an incredibly important part of this. They're doing all kinds of things wrong, and they're doing all kinds of things right, you know, and we need tons of pressure on them. Those are our brothers and sisters in the Maldives. That's the Student Government Association. They're holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate the existential problem of, I mean, these Maldives, okay, people have lived there for 5,000 years. That's how far back that culture goes. It is pretty much paradise. White sand beaches, coconut palms, 1,200 islands in this archipelago spread across the equator in the Indian Ocean. The only drawback is the highest point in the archipelago is about 2 meters above sea level, which is not a good place to be in the 21st century, okay, as sea level starts to rise. But they're doing everything they can to try and slow it down. This was the biggest story on Google News for a couple of days, and I think the reason is that people didn't look the way that editors thought they were supposed to, okay? There's Yemen, which is, you know, as tough a country as there is in the world at the moment, and that 0 is all women in full black burqa, right? So to us, they don't look like the local chapter of the Sierra Club, all right? But their hearts are in just the same place. They're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the future, about their children, about other people. So it was beautiful to see that it's everybody. So there's, you know, that's the oil-rich sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi. You can see some oil-rich sheikhs down front in their dish-dashes. Somewhat smarter than oil men elsewhere. You see behind them the edge of the largest solar array in the world, okay? They thinking they might want to stay rich no matter what. There were 400 or 500 pictures that ended up in a file marked 350 adorable. Indeed, they were adorable, you know. But they were also hard to look at. Those girls are going to be refugees in their lifetime. And not because of anything they did. You So we've kept up doing this kind of thing. You know, we think about 20,000 demonstrations around the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's been great fun in every corner of the world, kind of bringing this message, and all kinds of places where people didn't know what was going on, including large parts of this country. All kinds of places I'd never really heard of, you know, or places I'd heard of under other auspices. It's been beautiful. We've done big artwork. We did a day that they said was the biggest art project in the planet's history. So many thousands of people making these images. That's King Canute trying to hold back the water. That we needed a satellite to take the pictures of them. There's your friends not that far away in another arid, drought-stricken place. It's one of those dry arroyos in New Mexico. And when the satellite came over, a couple of thousand people put blue blankets up overhead just to bring the river back to life for a minute, you know, very moving. So I love doing this kind of thing, and I think it's really important, and I think if we had 50 years, it's exactly what we would just keep doing, okay? Because really, that's the way humans change best, you know, somewhat gradually, and we, you know, one generation picks up a message and passes it on, and you know, you get a Prius and your brother-in-law comes for Thanksgiving and sees it, puts the solar panels on the roof, and you know, eventually we get where we need to go and so on. We don't have 50 years. We needed to start 25 years ago, okay? We're so far behind the 8 ball that what we've felt like had to happen over the last few years is a very rapid intensification of this, beyond frankly, education to a kind of confrontation. And it's taken many forms. In 2011, some of you know this story about this, you've heard of this Keystone Pipeline thing. This was just one more pipeline that, you know, every pipeline anybody's ever proposed in this country has been built, and this one was just another, you know. But in that spring, Jim Hansen at NASA, our greatest climatologist, wrote a little paper saying, people might want to pay attention to this because this pipeline starts up in the tar sands of Canada, and that's one of the biggest deposits of carbon on Earth, and if we take all the economically accessible carbon out of there, then we can't save the planet's climate system. It's one of the 5 or 6 great deposits, carbon bombs around the world that have to be diffused. And when we read that, we thought we might as well try to figure out how to take this out. We had no chance. I mean, that summer, even after we'd begun to fight, the National Journal, which is the kind of insider newspaper in Washington, polled its 300 energy experts, congressional staffers, lobbyists, things. 91% of them said that TransCanada would have the permit for this pipeline by the end of 2011, because every pipeline ever had been approved. But then, 1,200 and some people went to jail. It was the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in this country in 30 years. Okay? And that was enough to begin to get this done deal to start coming undone, and it spread all over the world, and people started showing up in embassies and consulates, and then back in America, and we were surrounding the White House with people, and you know, this was 2011, about a year before the election. We had put 15,000 people shoulder to shoulder around the White House, and the next day Barack Obama said, maybe we should take some more time to decide on this, at least until after the next election. Okay? Which was good. And then after the next election, we sent more, you guys all, sent more emails to the Senate in a single day than on any issue in history, and more public comments than there'd ever been about anything. Any infrastructure project in American history. And the president decided best to wait until after the next election to do anything about it. We're still waiting, which is good in a sense, because it means that every day that's passed, 900,000 barrels of the dirtiest oil on Earth has stayed underground. And it's good because with no easy outlet for the oil, people have started, big investors started getting worried. Last summer, even before the price of oil began to fall, big companies pulled out of 3 huge planned expansions up there, $30 billion worth of expansions and mines that would have produced enough carbon, the equivalent of 700 new coal-fired power plants. So that was good. And maybe what was best was that it kind of got people looking at every other fossil fuel project in the world, really, and thinking, maybe we should try this here. So we've been working place after place, these plans for these big coal ports up in the Pacific Northwest, okay? They're not going to get built. We're going to stop them. And the plans for the biggest coal mine in the world in the Galilee Basin of Australia, and it's not going to get built, I don't think. We're going to stop it. And every pipeline project that anyone ever comes up with, the head of the American Natural Gas Association gave a speech to his industry a couple of weeks ago where he said, we simply have to figure out some way to stop the keystoneization of every pipeline project in the country. We're like, that was a good sign. Okay? Now, so it's been good. It's been good. We're fighting them as hard as we can in as many places as we can. But it's a little bit, it's sort of whack-a-mole too, because there's so many projects all the time in so many places, and it's like the little Dutch boy kind of sort of trying, we're sort of running out of fingers for the whole. So instead of playing just defense, we got to figure out how to play some offense too. And that's why a couple of years ago we started this divestment movement all over the country. Now I kind of wrote the article that started it in just about exactly 3 years ago, I guess, in Rolling Stone magazine. For those of you who keep your back issues, it was the one with Justin Bieber on the cover. And you know, what was weird was a couple of days later, the editor called me and said, "This is strange, but your piece has 10 times as many likes on Facebook as Justin's." And it wasn't. I mean, partly because of my soulful gaze, I think, but mostly because it wasn't such a great, beautifully written piece, but it had these new kind of pieces of information, this new math about climate change, taken this numbers that a few financial analysts in London had assembled. They'd done the work of going to find all the SEC filings and annual reports and things of all the big fossil fuel companies on Earth, and they added up how much carbon these guys already had in their reserves in the coal and oil and gas deposits still underground, but the ones they found and mapped and claimed and told their shareholders and their banks that they were going to burn. And when you add all that up, it comes to 5 times as much carbon as the scientists say we can burn if we have any hope of staying below a 2-degree rise in temperature, the kind of red line that the world has set as the absolute upper limit. It's not a very good upper limit. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we're kind of idiots to find out what 2 degrees will do, but we're probably going to find out, even if we do everything right. But the point is, they don't want to do everything right. Their business plans, if carried out, the planet tanks. And so when you know that, these become not normal companies, they become rogue companies. Okay? Once you know that, you know how the story ends. I mean, if they do what they've announced they're going to do, then there's no point in putting up our solar panels or, you know, pedaling our bicycles or whatever it is. They will pour enough carbon into the atmosphere to fatally heat the planet. So we decided it was one of these moments when, you know, the last time there was a big divestment campaign, it was around the issue of apartheid in South Africa 30 years ago. And it was successful. When Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first foreign trip he took was to the United States. He did not go first to the White House. He went first at Berkeley to thank students at the University of California system, who've been one of 155 colleges and universities around the country who forced divestment of stock. And he said, we fought for our own liberation, obviously. We liberated ourselves, but we could not have done it without the pressure that came from the outside. It was Mandela's great accomplice Desmond Tutu, who helped sound the call for this fossil fuel divestment, who said this is the greatest human rights challenge in the world. We need this same tool again because these companies won't change. We have to figure out how to break their political power. And that's why it's such the other reason beyond Sierra Nevada beer that I came to Chico was to say thank you to the people at Chico State who were, and stand up, brother, who were among the first colleges to demand and succeed in getting divestment of their stock. Now, it started in a few scattered places like Chico, and it has spread, it has acquired substantial momentum. There was a day last fall, in September, when we held a huge climate march in New York City. It was a beautiful day, and there were, somewhat to our surprise, 400,000 people who showed up to walk down 6th Avenue. A lot more than we expected, so it was mildly disorganized but extraordinarily beautiful, okay? The biggest march about anything in this country in many years, and a real sign. But just as wonderful was what happened that night uptown in New York at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where representatives of the Rockefeller philanthropies, the Rockefeller family, stood up and announced that they were selling all their holdings in coal and oil and gas. They said, not only is this not any longer fiscally wise, we're losing money doing it, it's also not morally okay anymore to be doing this, given what we know. If you think about that, it's a pretty remarkable moment. This is the first family of fossil fuel, the original oil fortune. That day between that march and that announcement, that day struck me as kind of the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel age. The question is how quickly we can bring it to an end. Can we make it end fast enough to keep from completely wrecking the planet or not, which is a very open question. But the pace is picking up. The months since have been, even the last couple of weeks have been astonishing. In the last couple of weeks in this divestment movement, Oxford, the oldest university in the English-speaking world, started down this divestment path. The Church of England joining the Unitarians and the United Church of Christ and the World Council of Churches. The University of Hawaii, with 56,000 students, announced that it was divesting. And then things started happening that were just so strange. The biggest insurance company in France, with $500 billion in assets under management, announced that it was getting out of coal completely, okay? Divesting, because it thought it was bad business and bad for the planet. Georgetown University, the probably most important, the sort of center of Catholic thought in this country in many ways, announced that it was doing likewise. A good sign, by the way, of the kind of changes that are coming later this month when the Pope releases his encyclical on climate change. 2 days ago, the former chairman of Shell Oil said, divestment is the rational route forward because the oil companies are not changing. They're not doing what they needed to do. Yesterday, Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund, the biggest single pool of investment capital on earth, $960 billion, announced that they were beginning to divest from coal. A powerful, powerful moment. The elites in this world are beginning to break apart from that richest and most powerful of industries. Other people are beginning to stand up to them. The thing that we wanted to do is starting to happen. We can't bankrupt Exxon, but we can politically bankrupt them. We can make it impossible for them to continue to dominate this debate the way that they have in the past. And that's what's starting to happen, okay? It's beautiful to see, and we thank all of you who have been engaged in it, and we need you all to keep pushing. on both these fronts, both this fight to keep fossil fuel underground and the fight to stop the financing of this atrocity. And you have tons of work to do here in California on both fronts, okay? Very happily, with the leadership of Senator De Leon, the California Senate 2 days ago passed a divestment resolution to get CalPERS and CalSTRS at least out of coal, which is a start, okay? It needs to go through the assembly. You need to call your assembly people and make sure that they're going to do the right thing. This state also needs to join states like my own in Vermont, to join states like New York, to join countries like France and Wales and Scotland in banning fracking. It is an obscenity in a drought. It's questionable in a drought whether growing rice is a great idea. It's absurd in a drought, absolutely absurd and obscene, to be pouring good water down a hole in the ground in order to push out more oil, which when it's burned will make the drought worse. That is, a working definition of insanity. And Jerry Brown, good though he is on other things, needs to be reminded that that is not okay, and the time has come to stop sucking up to Chevron and everybody else and do the right thing. Now, I've rattled on long enough here. I should show, let me just show a few. Much better to show pictures. Really what I want you to do is just get a sense of who your brothers and sisters in this fight all over the world are. We did a day a couple of years ago called Connect the Dots, where we just asked people in all the parts of the world who are already suffering the effects of climate change to kind of, day starts out in the far Pacific, so there's the guys in the Marshall Islands down on their coral reefs, which like most coral reefs are taking it in the chin right now. This is an ecosystem that may be gone by mid-century, more or less, but everywhere, You'd think in Afghanistan there were deeper things to worry about, but the Kabul River drying up's a big deal, Drought, so many places. Sea level rise, so many places. Some places the problem's less life and death, but it was so sad this year to look at those pictures from the backside of the Sierras and just see these sort of bleak pictures of people trying to ski down this sort of little strip of man-made snow in Squaw Valley. I mean, that's, this was a beautiful world we had, and it's our job to try and keep it. But everywhere, we get forest fires now in places 3 and 4 and 5 degrees latitude north of where there have ever been forest fires before because it's so hot and dry. And when those forest fires burn, they put carbon into the atmosphere. They also dump soot onto things like the Greenland ice sheet. Once it starts to get black, then it melts faster. Okay? The sort of cycles we kick off are dangerous. And these are people having to leave their homes in places like Micronesia. Top red balloon is where the level of the Dead Sea was 40 years ago. Just tons and tons of... these people are in the section of Pakistan that in 2010 saw the greatest flood since Noah. They had the kind of rain up in the Hindu Kush up there that you can only get in a world where the atmosphere is much warmer. It poured and poured and poured, and then that water came streaming down, and by the time it was done, 25% of Pakistan was underwater. 20 million people had to leave their homes. So imagine what kind of emergency it would be if 2/3 of the people in California had to evacuate their homes. Okay? Imagine what kind of, that's what the, and as you can tell from looking at them, they probably played a small role, if any, in causing the crisis from which they were suffering. Okay? It's just the same everywhere. Oh, that's my Vermont. I show it because I'm homesick. But we had the worst rains we've ever had in our history in 2011. And riverbanks, everything, the fields are now covered with sand and rocks. And it's been a slog for years to get back to anything like normal. But the same all over the world. And that's why it's so good to see this resistance rising in so many places. There's your brothers and sisters in Richmond, where I had the great pleasure of getting arrested last year at the demonstration at Chevron. And it was, among other things, amazingly moving, because it must be about the most, in this diverse state, about the most diverse city there is. At any rate, there were 6 of us in the paddy wagon, and we spoke 6 different languages. So it was, it was interesting. Everywhere. I'm going off to Minneapolis by midday tomorrow. I'll be in Minneapolis, and there's going to be a huge rally because there's pipeline after pipeline that they're trying to run down through the Midwest now. People are standing up and fighting, led in the upper Midwest and many other places now by indigenous people who in the last 3 or 4 years have risen up around the planet, and it's been beautiful to see. There's those pictures of the climate march in New York last September. The greatest concentration of people on this issue ever, and there were things going on around the world that day, and it was beautiful. But at the same time, just as beautiful, just as moving to me, maybe even more so, was what was happening in the Pacific. Okay? Our crews on 10 or 12 of those Pacific island nations, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, places that may well be underwater before the century is out. The people there rallied to build traditional indigenous canoes, one big one on each island, okay? Cut down trees which are rare there, but did it to build these amazing canoes, and then they took them off to Newcastle in Australia, which is the biggest coal port on the planet. And there they used them to block for a day some of the biggest ships on Earth, these giant coal ships. And it was a beautiful symbolic action, and man, it mattered, It's one of the things that's helped turn the tide there. We've now convinced pretty much every bank on Earth not to bankroll this big, huge proposed new coal mine. It would be the biggest coal mine in the world in this part of the Earth, and this was one of the big reasons why. This kind of solidarity all over the world, and this kind of bravery all over the world, is what we need. I'm not an organizer by trade, so I don't really, I don't really know how to sort of do the kind of altar call to get everybody completely. But if you've been keeping your powder dry for some reason, we're at the moment when we need you to do what you can do, okay? And on as big a scale as you can do. It's important to do stuff in your house, and it's important to do stuff in your town, and all those things are good, and really one should spend a lot of one energy close to home. But we need you to save some of it for these big, big fights, because in the end, climate change isn't going to be solved by individual action. My roof is covered with solar panels and has been for a long time. I drove the first hybrid electric Ford in the state of Vermont, I wrote a book once where I described feeding my family for a year only with food that came from our little valley, which is harder in Vermont than it is where you guys are, okay? Right about March, the vegetables begin to get a little much, it must be said, but that's all good. I like it, but I try not to fool myself that it's solving the problem. This is a structural and systemic problem, rooted in things like the fact that we don't have a price on carbon to reflect the damage it does in the atmosphere, rooted in the fact that our governments are not engaged in an all-out World War II kind of effort to put solar panels on every south-facing surface on the planet, We can't do those things because of the power of the fossil fuel industry. If we can break that power, then every economist in the world, left, right, center, so there should be a price on carbon. It's insane that there isn't. But there isn't because the political power of people like the Koch brothers is enough to keep it from happening. Okay? And so, we stand up. We stand up around divestment. We write letters, we march, we petition, occasionally, we even have to do things like go to jail. I look around this room and I'm pleased at its demographic diversity. Okay, I see a few people with heads of hair somewhat the same color as mine, and when I wrote the letter asking people to come to Washington to get arrested at that Keystone, not an easy thing, a letter to write actually. When I did, one of the things I said in it was, college kids should not be the cannon fodder in this case. They're leading the fight in all kinds of ways all around the world, mostly young people. But if you're 22 right now, it's plausible that an arrest record is maybe not the absolute best thing for your resume. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? So, it was with some pleasure that we watched lots of people of an age descend. Now, we did not say to people, how old are you? Because that would be rude as they were being arrested. But we did, I think, cleverly say, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administration. The last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck, said, World War II vet, handle with care, okay? He'd been so old that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was, I confess, long enough ago that I'd forgotten there really was a Warren Harding administration. Okay? And so, you know, it was what it really was moving for all the kids that were there to see their elders actually acting the way elders are supposed to in a working society. Okay? Yeah. It was nice. So, figure out ways and places to try and keep pushing hard, because an awful lot is at stake. I actually can't promise you that we're going to win, which is a bad thing. Most other causes that people have engaged in, even if they had to be significantly braver than we have to be. I mean, if you were in the heart of the civil rights movement in the 60s, you know, people were sometimes shooting at you and beating you and things. And so far, at least in this country, that doesn't happen with environmentalists, though it does elsewhere. But they had one thing that we don't have, which I think was pretty much a strong sense that eventually they would win. Dr. King always said at the end of his speeches, he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we will win. The arc of the physical universe appears to be short and bend toward heat, okay? And if we don't win soon, we don't win. So, no promises. We're definitely not going to stop global warming. Too late for that, okay? We can't reverse in timescales of our lives or even our children's lives the damage we've already done, and there's more in the pipeline, even if we do everything right from here on in. But the best science indicates we may still be able to keep it from getting entirely out of control, which is reason enough to do what we can, okay? And maybe do a little more than we think we can do. No guarantee that we'll win, but an absolute ironclad guarantee, because I've spent a lot of time on the road in the last 7 or 8 years, an absolute guarantee that if you stand up, you will be standing up with other people in every corner of the planet who are trying to do the same thing. There are people meeting in every continent and most countries tonight, just in rooms like this one, trying to plot out the next steps and figure out what to do next and how to make it work. Okay? And it's always an honor for me to be in those rooms, and it's a huge honor for me to be here in this room with you all tonight, because I know the good stuff that you've done and the good stuff that you will do, and I just look forward to being shoulder to shoulder with you while we're doing it. Thank you all very much.